Hello everyone, this is me, I'm Yongkang. So today I'm going to show you how to build a Tanzu Kubernetes cluster on AWS EC2. So there are multiple deployment options when you talk about a Tanzu Kubernetes Grid or TKG. I took a copy of the deployment options from their website. So you can either deploy Tanzu Kubernetes Cluster from a vSphere, VMware vSphere, either 7 6.7 update 3, or you can deploy to AWS EC2 instance. Also, it allows you to deploy to multi-cloud. Could be running from Microsoft Azure, VMware Cloud, or Amazon Cloud. So for today's session, I will show you how to deploy Tanzu Kubernetes Cluster from AWS EC2. So on the high level, there are 3 steps to build a Tanzu Kubernetes cluster on EC2 instances. So first of all, you need a little bit of preparation tasks. So primarily, you need to install the required tools. And secondly, you need to deploy a management cluster first. And finally, you can deploy a Tanzu Kubernetes cluster. That's the work cluster. Actually, customer running the workloads in the Tanzu Kubernetes cluster, not to deploy the workloads to the management cluster. So here are the preparation tasks to deploy a management cluster. We need a bootstrap machine. It can be Linux, can be Mac OS, can be Windows, but you need at least 2 CPU, 6 GB memory. So why? Because you need to have the Docker client installed. It does require a little bit of resources. And you also need to have the Tanzu CLI installed locally. Additionally, you need to have the JQ installed. Since we are going to deploy to AWS Cloud, you need to have the AWS CLI installed. And obviously, you need to have the AWS account credentials with enough permissions. For the testing purposes, I just use AWS admin. So how to deploy a management cluster on EC2 instances? So first of all, in your very first time, you're going to deploy management cluster on EC2. You need to create IAM resources. So it's part of this command. You just run Tanzu management dash cluster permissions followed by AWS set. So what's going to happen is it would make an API call to create a AWS cloud formation stack to create the related IAM rules and also instance profiles. This must be done first. Otherwise, down the path, you're waiting like 20+ minutes and then you hit the error. Okay, after you create the IAM resources, you got 2 options. Either you can use the UI, it's a web UI, or you can use the command line. So if you choose to use the web UI, you run the command from your bootstrap machine, Tanzu management cluster create --UI. If you run from the command line, use the command line instead of the web UI. You just run the similar command but followed by --file with the configuration file. Okay, it takes around 24 minutes to deploy a management cluster. After the management cluster deployed, you can deploy a Tanzu workload cluster. So for the workload cluster deployment, looks like VMware does not provide a UI option. So all we need to do is you either create or copy an existing configuration file for the workload cluster. I will show you how to copy or create the configuration file. And after that, you just run the Tanzu cluster create command. So Tanzu cluster create followed by -- file, and then with your configuration file here. So in this case, we will build the actual workload cluster. So after workload cluster completed successfully, you can verify the Tanzu cluster created by this command, Tanzu cluster get. So you can see the details of the cluster. So before I jump to the reference details, let me just log into my VS Code. So that's where I will run the Tanzu management cluster create command. So before I do that, just make sure you got the Tanzu installed, Tanzu CI installed, you got AWS CI installed, and you also have the JQ installed. You might also want to verify to see if the Docker is running. So I got a Docker desktop running on my MacBook. So if Docker isn't running, when you run the command Tanzu management cluster create --UI, we're going to launch web console to create the management cluster. So if Docker isn't running, it will give an error message say you need to start your Docker first. So here is the web UI to create the Tanzu management cluster. You got 3 options. You can either deploy to VMware vSphere, Amazon EC2, or Microsoft Azure. In this case, I will deploy to Amazon EC2. So I click here. So I did create the management cluster earlier. I can restore the data, so I don't have to re-enter the field. So I click restore data. So it will ask you some of the details where which credential profile you're going to use. I will use my Yongkang as an AWS credential profile, and which region. So I will use US East-2 region. So just to highlight this option, the management cluster, the TKG running on EC2, it's not available in every region. Before you select the region, just make sure the region is supported. So US East 2, US East 1 supported. I choose US East 2, and then I click connect. So it is showing connected. I click next. So I will create a new VPC on AWS. I'm going to choose a different VPC side. I use 10.8.0.0 and click next. So you got 2 type of the management cluster settings, either deployment, development, or production. So since it's a testing, I use the development. I choose T3A.large instance type. And the management cluster name, so I give a name TKG management cluster for Yongkang 1 and running on AWS. And you will also be asked to have the EC2 key pairs. If you don't, if you can't remember the EC2 key pair, you need to jump to, actually, let me log in. I can't remember the EC2 key pair. So I need to log into my console, the best console. I sign to my console. I use my account ID and click sign in. So I logged in, and then I need to verify my EC2 key pair. So this is also a must-have. It is required. So if I go to my key pairs, so I got a key pair name, I copy paste the key pair name. Come back to the Tanzu UI, paste the token part, token, paste the EC2 key pair name here. So do I need a bastion host? I don't need. Machine health check, I leave it as it is. Which availability zone I'm going to use? I choose the US East to C. Excuse me. That's all we need for now. Click next. Oh yes, I forgot there. The instance type, the workload instance type, I also need to make a selection. I choose T3A.large. That's the workload instance type. So what's going to happen is that from the management cluster, you also have the control plane and also you have the workload. So click next. Give a label owner is wrong. Click next. So the network settings, I just leave it as default. And for the identity management, for now, I'm not going to integrate with OIDC or LDAPs. So let me take that. Next, I choose the image. So the image which we're going to use, you can choose either Amazon, Linux, or choose Ubuntu. I use Ubuntu for now. Click next. Optionally, you can register with Tanzu Mission Control. I'm not going to use the Tanzu Mission Control now. And I don't want to join the customer experience improvement program now. Click next. You got the option to review the settings. Once you are happy with the settings, you just click deploy. So before you click deploy, you actually can copy the configuration file. Next time, if you want to run again to create the cluster, instead of go from the web console, you just run the command. So I make a copy of the command, click deploy management cluster, and shortly it will launch and it will give you the progress from the UI. You can see the configuration prerequisites, validated configurations, and generate cluster configurations. And now it's set up a bootstrap cluster. So this step, the whole step, it does take like around 24 minutes. So I'm going to pause the recording for now until the creation finish. So I'm going to. Okay, as you can see, now the deployment of the management cluster has completed all successfully. Now, if I want to confirm what we built from our AWS, you can go back to AWS console, go to the EC2 dashboard. You can see I got 2 instances running here. So both of the EC2 instance names, starting with TKG, that's my cluster name, followed by MD, that's machine, that's the machine, basically that's the workload, and also the other instance name is a control plane, okay? So if I go back to the VS Code command line, you can see the job also completed successfully. If I want to verify the management cluster, you can run the Tanzu management cluster get. You can see what's built. So it might take a few seconds to pop up the results. And as you can see, so this is my management cluster name. It's TKGm management cluster. And it's running Kubernetes version 1.21.2. It's from a VMware. And you got your control plane, and you got your machine deployment. It's called machine deployment. That's the workload. And you got your namespace all created part of the management cluster deployment. Okay, now we can deploy the management cluster. Now let's continue to create a work cluster. So as you can see, after we created the management cluster, you got the command here. You can run the Tanzu cluster create to create the cluster, but you need the configuration file. I make a copy of the command while we are building the management cluster. So if I do a view, cat this file, you can see it's a very simple configuration file. It just give all these settings. So I'm actually already make a copy of the file. And if you want, you can customize your cluster side, your VPC side range, and also your cluster name. So basically the configuration file, it's similar, yeah, while you're building the workload cluster and also management cluster, the configuration file are exactly the same, but you might want to customize the cluster name. I actually got my configuration file here. Let me show you. If I VI the TKG, that's my work cluster. So you can see I've got my work cluster. I also created the work cluster in the US East 2C region. So this time I was using the 10.9. That's my VPC side range, and my key SSH key pair name, I was using the same one. Then my VPC, that's a 10.9/16. My cluster name, TKG WC work cluster for Yongkang-AWS. So I also have the control plane, machine type, and all the settings. Yeah. So you don't have to customize too much. Just make sure you got different, because the cluster name correct. And also, if you prefer to use a different VPC, different side range, you need to customize that. So let's continue to create the cluster. Tanzu cluster, create, and -f or dash file, and with your TKG, the configuration file name, WC, that's my work cluster, and then click end. So we are going to, right now, we are creating a workload cluster. So this step also takes like a few more minutes. Let's wait and see. I might pause again. Once the creation finish, I will come back. Okay, as you can see from the screen, now the workload cluster TKG-WC for Yongkang-AWS also created. So how to verify? We just run the Tanzu cluster get the cluster name. It might take a couple of seconds before it pop up the results. In the meantime, let me switch to the AWS console. So from the AWS console, if I do a refresh, you're expecting to see 2 more instances. So the WC, that's the workload cluster control plane. This is a workload cluster machine deployment. That's the workload. So that's why I got 4 EC2 instances, 2 for the management cluster, 2 for the actual workload cluster. So my environment is ready actually. So let me come back to the VS Code. Yeah, we can see from here. So this is my TKG work cluster, and got a control plane EC2 instance machine, and I also got a workload. Yeah, that basically completes the deployment of the TKG cluster on AWS EC2 instances. Let me come back to the slide deck. Here are a couple of links with the references. So the first one is if you want the latest version of the TKG, that's 1.4. Here is a link directly go to the documentation of the TKG. And secondly, where to download the Tanzu CLI and the kubectl. It is actually VMware did not make it easy. You still need to log into my VMware.com and then go to the download page and search the Tanzu CLI, the 1.4, that's the latest version. And optionally, you can also download the kubectl from a VMware site. Yeah, but you don't have to download the kubectl from VMware site. Also, here is a link. You need to download the Docker. So the Docker client you can deploy to Linux, Windows, or Mac OS. So what's coming next? So I already built the management cluster. I built a workload cluster. So I'm going to deploy a database into the TKG workload cluster. I'm going to show you how to back up the container workloads running on Tanzu Kubernetes Cluster. And I'm going to show you how to restore the container workloads running on TKG. Yeah, that's pretty much all I want to cover for today. Yeah, thank you very much for your time. If you have any feedback or any questions, feel free to email me or connect me via LinkedIn, Twitter. You can also visit my YouTube page and you can access my GitHub page. Thank you for watching. Have a good day. Bye.